Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this online WES talk organised by the New Room Bristol in partnership with the Methodist Churches Learning Network Southwest. The New Room is the oldest Methodist building in the world. Situated in Bristol city centre, John Wesley called the chapel a light in the city and used it as a base for his work. In 2017, a new visitor centre opened on the site, which features a new revamped museum, cafe, shop, library, and meeting rooms. My name is Mandy Briggs, and I'm the Education Officer here at the New Room. Behind the scenes is my colleague, Kate Rogers, who will be heading up the technical side of the talk this evening. Just a couple of tech notes to share before we bring our speakers in. Please note that this talk is being recorded. During the talk, you will be able to hear and see our speakers as they speak and as they talk to each other, but your own video and audio will be turned off. If you have a particular question that you would like to ask the panel, please save them for the question time towards the end of the hour, when we will ask you to write your questions into the Q&A facility that you'll see at the bottom of the screen. You can access this by clicking on Q&A instead of the chat. So our WES Talk series aims to explore life and faith in today's world, often by linking back to historic characters who tried to make a difference or stood up for what they believed. And this evening, we're exploring the story of the Tolpuddle Martyrs and reflecting on how their story can still speak to us today. This is a story that some people are very familiar with, but others are coming to you new. So I hope that whatever your prior knowledge of this story, you'll gain something from our discussion this evening. So I'd like to introduce you to our two contributors. Our first speaker is Revd Steph Jenner. Hello, Steph.
Hi.
Steph is a supernumerary Methodist minister who retired early due to ill health. And before this, she was the Superintendent Minister of the Bridport and Dorchester Methodist Circuit, now the Dorset South and West Circuit with Weymouth and Portland, which is quite a long title. Here she had responsibility for the current Methodist Chapel at Tolpuddle, but was also one of the founding members of the Tolpuddle Old Chapel Trust, TOCT, which bought, preserved, and is restoring the original chapel in the village. Active at the annual Tolpuddle Festival, the Trust secured wider Methodist participation over the last 8 years, making it a necessary diary date for each new Methodist president and vice president. And also a welcome to Simon Topping. Hello, Simon.
Hello.
Revd Simon Topping is currently working in the Methodist Church's Gloucestershire Circuit, excuse me, and has been a Methodist Presbyter for over 30 years, with appointments also in Birmingham, South London and Argentina. He has been involved in 2 pilgrimages to Tolpuddle and 2 long-distance marches to G7 summits as part of the campaign to cancel debt in poor countries. Simon was co-founder of the Green Cross Co-op, a Christian workers co-op based in Gloucester. In September, he will become the superintendent of the North East, Somerset and Bath Circuit. Well, thank you very much both for being here this evening and for taking part in our discussion. First of all, I'm going to ask Steph to speak about the Tolpuddle Martyrs for about 20 minutes. And then I'm going to ask Simon to rejoin us to tell us a little bit about his pilgrimage experiences to Tolpuddle. So Steph, thank you so much. Over to you.
Quite all right. Hello, everybody. It's very odd having a Zoom where I can't see you all, but hopefully you can see and hear me okay. Yes, it was my delight when I moved down to the then Bridport and Dorchester Circuit to find that Tolpuddle was going to be one of my chapels, and my mother, who lives also in Dorset, dug out the photos of our Sunday school trip there. So I went as a pre-teen to Tolpuddle, and that first started my interest in their story. So it was great to come full circle several years later, several tens of years later, to the chapel. Tolpuddle is a very interesting place because it's claimed by lots of different people, and what we were able to do as members of the circuit and wider, and then also members of the Tolpuddle Old Chapel Trust, is to really try and bring the Methodist story back into the forefront of the story that the unions were telling. And it's worked really well. I mean, even before I came here, David Wrighton of the IBEX, which is Churches Working in Industry, worked very much closely. And at the festival, we blessed the parade from the stage, and the parade walks up to the new chapel, and where the arch is that commemorates the 6 martyrs, as well as being the people who laid the first wreath on the grave of James Hammett, the only martyr to be buried back in Tolpuddle. And so Methodism was acknowledged by the unions, but most of the people there didn't know the story. So it was quite fun to tell people the story. The shirt that I'm wearing, if you can just see there, the logo on, it says Tolpuddle Chapel and God is my guide. And we made these polo shirts so that we could mingle around during the festival and be people and representatives. I converted mine with a collar, but that's all sort of by the by. The Tolpuddle Martyrs are 6 men from the village of Tolpuddle who were farm labourers who were struggling, shall we say, with their wages, and they met with the farmers, the landowners that they worked for, and asked them to basically have a living wage. And not only did that not occur, well, it did sort of for a month or two, but then their wages started to go down. So they decided they really couldn't live on what was 7 shillings a week when neighbouring counties were being paid 10 shillings a week, and it was threatened to go down. So they got together to make a union, which was legal at that time, but because they swore an oath, the landowner felt that this was something that was wrong, sent people to infiltrate the meeting and then report back on the meeting, and the 6 men who were there were arrested and taken to Dorchester prison, where they were tried and then sent overseas. They did receive a pardon, but it took several years for them to come back, and they were never really welcomed back to Tolpuddle itself. They went to farm firstly in Essex and then over in Canada, where they didn't tell anybody what had happened to them, but some of them became quite prominent citizens, even mayor, and it was only sort of further generations down that they got to learn the story of what they had done, and that story was then reported back. The martyrs themselves, the 6 of them, George Lovelace, probably seen as the leader, and his brother James, Thomas Stanfield and his son John, James Brine and James Hammett. There is obviously familial relations between the two, but there's also marriages between the families, so there were very strong bonds between them through family, through the chapel, and then through the union. So these were men that knew each other very well, their families knew each other very well. What has always struck me about what they did and how they did was, and this is why I think their story still speaks today, is all about communication. George Lovelace was a literate man. He was a lay preacher, local preacher, and he travelled around the then Weymouth Circuit, which is bigger than the current Dorset South and West Circuit, I think, and would preach and obviously talked to the people at all the chapels that he went to. And so he was quite learned, and he had his finger on the pulse, we would say today, of what was happening and around, and he knew a lot. He spoke to the other members of the other chapels who perhaps laboured and knew what their circumstances was. So when he went before the magistrates, he had a lot of information to his fingertips. He was not alone in being educated. At least two of the other martyrs were lay preachers as well, so they were educated enough to be able to read the Bibles and write notes and speak eloquently. But George was also involved in the Sunday schools, and he taught at least James Brine to read and write, and many other people besides. It's interesting to note when the first Tolpuddle Chapel opened, the 12 people who were the original trustees, locally from Tolpuddle and further around, of the 12, 10 were actually able to sign their names, which is a very high proportion of literacy. So the Tolpuddle Martyrs were able to read and write and speak eloquently and knowledgeably. They could communicate well amongst themselves, and so when they got brought up before say the magistrates and the landowners, they could speak with knowledge, and I think this frightened those in power, because they thought of them as poor ignorant workers and didn't expect this, and I think it just riled them up even further, so that when they got sent to the jail, basically there was going to be no chance at all. They'd got their licence to open the chapel, which was opened in 1818, and we celebrated the 200th anniversary 3 years back. But they were never liked in the village, never well thought of. The day the chapel opened, I'm afraid to say the Anglicans all came and threw stones at them and tried to overturn the carriages, etc. So part of the reason that they were dealt with as they were was because they were seen as dissenters. They were seen as anti-establishment. They were seen as troublemakers, even though actually the lives they led were a lot more clean and sober and law-abiding than many of the other people around. This was part of the plea that went after they were transported that enabled their pardon. The other part was the fact that what they had done was not illegal. They had taken an oath, but so did all the Freemasons, so did all the Orangemen, and so did a society of which the Prince Regent or Crown Prince belonged to. And when this was pointed out in higher up places, they were granted their pardon. But nobody actually told them. They only found out through newspapers that they had seen by accident almost when they were in Australia, were allowed to come back. But back to the sort of communication side of things. George Lovelace wrote quite eloquently. I've got a few visual aids here. I haven't put them on slides, but hopefully you'll be able to see them. This one is called The Martyrs' Account, the Victims of Whiggery, George Lovelace. He wrote this and was able to quite eloquently put out how he felt that people had been treating them. And this was the letter that he actually wrote, called The Church Shown Up, and basically saying that, the way they were treated was very unchristian, and not quite, this was one of the reasons he wasn't Church of England, but he felt that the people who were in power were just paying lip service to being Christian and weren't actually being Christian. And you can imagine this got everybody very angry about it. But the communication that he was able to deliver just showed that he wasn't just a poor background farm labourer who was just whining about his lot. He actually had a point. He had a lovely argument when he went to see before they got to sort of the man being lowered. He sort of said to them, is not Dorsetshire as good as Hampshire? Hampshire? And they said, oh yes, yes, it was as good as Hampshire. And are not the fields and the land in Dorset as good as Hampshire? Oh yes, 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 they're definitely as good. So, you know, are not the workers in Dorsetshire as good as the ones in Hampshire? Oh yes, yes, yes. Well, how come you pay us 7 shillings and you pay them 10? They didn't expect that sort of knowledge, that sort of argument, taken with all that George and the others could do. Aside from the Methodism part and the being together at chapel, during the day, during their working day, these men, a lot of them worked together. They would have talked to one another. They would have talked through their discrepancies in the field and what they were doing, talking about what was happening to them, talking about what they needed to do about it, how to take the stance on it, and you know, and make sure that everybody was towing the line. This time in history was when, like, the swing riots and all those sorts of things were happening. But George made sure that none of the people, either in the union or in the church, were involved in the riots, so that couldn't be levelled at them, that they were, you know, disruptive influence and dissenters. And he did that, you know, through example and through words, through communication. But the third aspect of the communicating is at home, because most of these men had wives and children. Some of them, as I say, the families were married together, so they would have spent time together with each other, and the wives and children shared the lot of having to work to make ends meet, especially when the men's wages were going down. And of course they were the ones left behind when the men were transported. So they talked to each other, and they helped each other. They all knew what was going on. And it's quite fascinating that while a lot of the literature is focused on the men, and you get plays such as The 6 Men of Dorset, there's also a play about the women called Martyred Wives, which looks at how the women dealt with what was happening as well. So there is lots of things out there to help you understand the story of what happened and why it happened. But to me, the important thing is, as I say, the relationships, the communication, how they stuck together, how they banded together, how they looked after one another when they were close together and when they were far apart. And that still happens in a church context, in a village context, in a farming context today. So I think that's my 20 minutes.
Thank you, Steph. So many things to think about already, but I'm going to bring Simon back in now. And Simon's going to talk to us in a slightly different way, just reflecting a little bit on his experiences of walking to Tolpuddle as a pilgrim, of trying to understand that story of the Tolpuddle Martyrs, and maybe trying to communicate that story and understand what it might mean to us now. Simon, can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can. I'm seeing a rather strange screen in front of me, but I guess that's what I should be seeing.
Okay, yes, we can hear you loud and clear, and see you as well.
Right, okay, good. Okay, well, yes, I'm just going to spend a few minutes giving a little bit of the story of our pilgrimage, our second pilgrimage to Tolpuddle that took place in 2019, and just highlight a few of the highlights, the key points of that pilgrimage. We began at the New Room, 12 pilgrims from quite a range of different Christian backgrounds, Anglicans, Methodists, 2 from an independent evangelical church. And the New Room was a good place to start. It's an obvious place to start the pilgrimage, because it in itself is a pilgrimage centre, as Mandy was saying. It's the oldest building in Methodism, and many people make a pilgrimage from different parts of the world to the new room. So it seemed to make sense to begin our pilgrimage, Methodist inspired pilgrimage, from the new room. So we all gathered there, and before Mandy blessed us on our way, we had a look around the new museum in the new room, and immediately we were able to start making links between the story of the Tolpuddle Martyrs and what we were seeing in the museum. One of the elements of that museum is the story of Wesley's stand against slavery, and his very active stand against slavery, and encouraging all Methodists to be involved in that struggle to end slavery and the slave trade. And so there in that museum was a story of Methodist struggle for justice, and our pilgrimage was in honor of a group of Methodists in Tolpuddle who were also involved in a different kind of struggle for justice, economic justice, justice for the laborers in the fields. But the two are linked, I think, in the sense that both these stories of battling for justice are rooted in a desire to transform the unjust structures of society, not just to deal with the symptoms of injustice, but to transform structures and oppressive practices and relationships. And I think that's an important part of Methodist understanding of what it means to be involved in the struggle for justice. It goes beyond working to address symptoms, and actually goes to the root causes of the injustice. So that was great to spend some time in the New Room Museum and explore the links between Wesley's struggle and the Tolpuddle Martyrs struggle. We then set off, and within about 10 minutes, we had our first encounter on the pilgrimage, because we found ourselves caught up in an Extinction Rebellion demonstration. We didn't know it was happening, and it was taking place on a bridge. They blocked a bridge in Bristol with a big pink boat, blocked it to traffic, and we were crossing over to the other side. So we met the demonstrators, we took part, we were very much wanting to support what they were doing, and they were interested in us and what we were doing. And in fact, one of them was asking us about our pilgrims badges. We had these little white cloth pilgrim shell badges. Each one of us had them on our lapels, and somebody thought, oh, well, you must have brought those along to highlight the bleaching of coral caused by acidity in the seas, and also caused by global warming itself. We hadn't obviously made that connection. We were wearing them as signs that we were on a pilgrimage, but it was a nice link to make. And that was one of the joys of the pilgrimage throughout the 6 days of the pilgrimage, were these unexpected encounters, meetings with people, and opportunities to share our story as we went. So we travelled from there through Bristol, stopping in a couple of Methodist sites en route to meet the people and learn about what they were doing, and for us to talk about what we were doing. And then as we travelled down to Tolpuddle, we stayed overnight, mainly in Methodist churches on church hall floors. We stayed at Chewstoke Methodist Church, at Wells Methodist Church. We also stayed at Castle Carey Methodist Church and Sherborne United Church, which is Methodist URC. And then on the last night, we were at Hillfield Priory, which is a Franciscan, Anglican Franciscan priory in Cerne Abbas. And one of the people on our pilgrimage with us was a friar, Brother Hugh, from that friary. And so we stayed on a hall floor there, and were able to participate in their pattern of prayer. And that was one of the important features of our pilgrimage, was that we developed a pattern for each day. You could say we became a kind of intentional community on the move. It was an experience of being in intentional community. We prayed together, we ate together, we walked together, we reflected together. And that experience of being in community, even though on the move, was an important one for us on the pilgrimage, as was the opportunity to story tell, telling each other's stories as we walked, but also when we stayed in those churches, telling that story that we've heard tonight, the story of the Tolpuddle Martyrs, and also hearing other people's stories, stories from churches on the route. And I think that's an important element of any pilgrimage, is that storytelling and sharing together. And then, of course, the other important element of this pilgrimage for us was learning ourselves about the story of the Tolpuddle Martyrs, and especially how their Christian faith and how the words of the Bible underpinned their activism. Particularly in the writings of George Lovelace, we see how he uses as a resource for his activism and for his understanding of the nature of justice. He uses his biblical knowledge, he uses his Christian faith, and perhaps later on we could look at one or two of the themes that he particularly draws out that were important for him in his struggle. So eventually we arrived at the festival in time for the events of the festival. We enjoyed being part of the festival, and of course we were involved in the procession of banners with the other Methodists on the Sunday, and then shared in the service at the new Methodist Chapel, where Reverend Barbara Glasson, the president for that year, was preaching. So it was a good experience. Myself and Richard Sharples, who's a Methodist minister in Bristol, we're trying to put together a guide, a pilgrimage guide, Newham to Tolpuddle, and we're working on that now, and hope that we'll be able to produce that so that people can use it to do their own pilgrimages down there in coming years. So I think if I stop there now, and I can pick up anything if you want to ask more about it later on.
Thank you, Simon. That's a really interesting, different view of how you've engaged with the story. I think we're all back on screen now, and I hope you can hear me okay. I was doing a little bit of reading before this evening about the fact that in many other places in Dorset there had been riots because the labourers had been, so angry about their lack of pay, the difficult conditions under which they were working. Steph, I was just wondering, was the fact that most of these men were Methodists, do you think that contributed to the fact that they didn't choose to riot, but they chose to form a union instead? Was that a kind of a peaceful protest?
I think so. I think George was very much their leader, and as Simon has said, he was very much understanding of justice and how it worked through his personal experience, but through his biblical knowledge as well. And I think he probably went round to them and said, don't do this, because then they've got something against us, as it were, and talked to them about how best to better their lot that wasn't writing. And in one of the books that I showed you, he clearly says to the landowner, come and stand in front of the magistrate and say to them, when you saw me writing, when you saw us writing, when you saw us doing, you can't, because we didn't. And he was very, very aware that, anything that was on the wrong side of the law could be used against them. And so they were very surprised when they were firstly arrested, because they knew they weren't breaking the law, and secondly when they were in jail and it started to turn against them, even though they knew they had done nothing wrong, yet other people who had were getting away with it. So they knew they were being victimized, and one of the big reasons was because they were dissenters, nonconformists, they were Methodists, and that wasn't liked because they were free thinkers. They could talk about liberty and justice, not just for themselves but for everybody, and yeah, that's where it went. So it was a deliberate act not to riot, led by George, who I think understood very much the consequences. James Brine, the youngest of the martyrs, I mean, he was only a teenager, so you can imagine he was perhaps a bit of a hothead and he really wanted to get involved, but he was sort of slightly taken under George's wing, who said, no, don't do it, don't do it.
I find that really, really interesting, because obviously, as Simon, as you were speaking and you were talking about coming across the Extinction Rebellion protest, I think, if I'm right, that Extinction Rebellion would very much go along with the actions of peaceful protest. And I wonder if that helped you make links with the Tolpuddle Martyrs, that, you know, their Methodism enabled them not to riot, but to engage in this sort of peaceful act. And I wondered if you wanted to say any more about that.
Yes, I mean, I think it certainly is true. I think with Extinction Rebellion, I come from Stroud, which is the birthplace of Extinction Rebellion. A lot of the leaders are from that area, and yes, they have made a point of underlining the importance of non-violence, of peaceful protest, although probably the most militant wing of Extinction Rebellion are Christian Climate Action. Actually, they're the ones who seem to get themselves arrested more often than anybody else. So I think there is a sort of you can be both non-violent and militant, I think, and I think it seems to me, certainly when you look at some of the writings of George Lovelace, he certainly was quite prepared to be forceful in his language, but as Steph was saying, was a man of peace in terms of his actions, and encouraged that in others too, and there's a long tradition of that non-violent, peaceful militancy. You know, we see it in Martin Luther King, also another approach from a Christian background of protest that's rooted in non-violence. So I think there's a thread there that runs between them.
And Steph, did the Tolpuddle men, the group of men, did they receive any support from the National Methodist Church at the time, do you know?
They did. There was I'm sorry, I'm just referring to notes here. There was a local Methodist, Joseph Bridle of Beer Regis. Now, those of you who know the area, Beer Regis is literally a stone's throw from Tolpuddle, especially if you walk across the fields, as they would have done. And there was a Methodist chapel there that was built in very similar times and to a very similar footprint as the original Tolpuddle Chapel, and there still is a chapel in Beer Heath, which is a farming community from Beer Regis. But Joseph Bridle of the Beer Regis Church, he acted as an intermediary between the London Dorchester Committee and the martyr families. So there is some talk that they weren't supported locally, but I think they were by the wider Methodist circuit, not the Primitives, but the Wesleyans, because they were a Wesleyan church. But from London, where the Lovelaces had family, because George had a lot of siblings and some of them were in London, there was definitely help from there, both sort of support and financial help from there. And obviously with all the men being transported off, or most of the men being transported off, the numbers in the original chapel fell, but the women still made up the membership, and I imagine a bit like happens today when a chapel might be in trouble, people come from neighbouring chapels and come and support them, you know, either with being there or with the singing, or, you know, supply of preachers and stuff. So there is good documentary evidence that the other Methodists came, and there was a big protest in London about the Tolpuddle Martyrs, which was part of their pardon. So the story of the 6 men in Tolpuddle from a very small Dorset village through the Methodist network of communication and family network of communication actually became a very big story at the time. So, and really quite quickly, in terms of the early 1800s, it went very quickly. So it all happens very quickly, but actually the help was there quickly as well. The protests were there quickly as well. The story was told quickly as well. It just took a long time for that to get all the way over to Australia and for the pardon to happen, for the men to eventually come back.
Sure. I found it amazing that when you said that they found out about it through reading it in the newspaper and nobody had told them.
No, I think the women were allowed to go out and join the men in Australia, but they didn't want to. But they had no real way of communicating to them that they were allowed to come back. And this is whether my memory's working or not. I'm pretty sure that they found out through somebody who'd come over newly on the ships that had a newspaper, and the newspaper had said about the pardon, and that was how they found out. But of course they were separated by that point, so to let them all know wasn't as easy. So it's one of those amazing stories of, some would say coincidence, some would say God incidents, but I think it's just an amazing story.
In a moment, I'm going to be taking some questions from the attendees at the talk. So just a reminder to everybody at the talk that if you do have a question for Steph or Simon, please don't use the chat box, but please put your question in the Q&A section at the bottom, where you can click on Q&A and then type your question into that box. I'm kind of interested in how the Tolpuddle Martyrs story started as a story with a lot of faith in it, and then developed into more of a something that was told as a political story. I wonder if you could comment a little bit about that, Steph.
It was one of the things that was an accusation that was levelled at the martyrs, that they were mixing religion and politics, and they shouldn't. So I think it became political quite early on. Their story, the courthouse at Dorchester was one of the first to have a press desk, so there was actually somebody there reporting the news. So it went through the presses and into London, where it was fairly instantly picked up and could be seen as a political thing, because they were forming a union, which they were allowed to do, although it wasn't liked in Dorset at the time. So it is said that the Labour Party, by members of the Labour Party, by leaders of the Labour Party, including Jeremy Corbyn, who, as you all know, comes to Tolpuddle, that the Labour movement has more of its roots in Methodism than in Marxism. So I think the two things grew together. And when the unions were growing, probably somebody said, "Oh, you do know the story of," and then that became a place of focus, almost a place of pilgrimage for the unions, as well as a place of pilgrimage for Methodists, and a place of pilgrimage for lots of people who are seeking justice for all sorts of things. When we're at the festival, we meet all sorts of people who are there for all sorts of reasons. And I remember the first year I was there, so it would have been 2014, we'd taken various headlines from the Methodist Recorder and put it on our stall in the tent where people come visit. And we had people from Scotland coming past going, "Oh, I didn't know you had a view on Trident." And then somebody else going, "Oh, you've got a thing here about, the Gambling Commission and poverty and the food banks and so on." So all these different groups who have all their different causes that they're really interested in discovered that we were interested in them as well. I mean, as Simon obviously found out on his journey through, you know, we've got so much in common. I mean, Methodists, particularly, Christians certainly, and ordinary people that have these things that I think you can't help but be political. I think the big crunch with the martyrs came when they were definitely the lower classes and the lowest of the low classes, and the upper classes were the ones who did everything and expected everybody else to stay in their place and didn't like it when they didn't, and that became politicised and reported, and then it all grew from there.
Thank you.
From a tiny little village and a one act, I mean, I'm sure this sort of thing was happening all over the country, but somehow this was the one that got the focus.
Thank you. That is absolutely fascinating, and thank you for fleshing that out a little bit. Simon, I was wondering, when you were down in Tolpuddle at the end of your pilgrimage, who did you meet? Did you have any interesting conversations with people that you wouldn't normally have had conversations with?
Well, we did have conversations with people who were there from the unions, and by and large there was real interest and enthusiasm for us coming as Methodists to the event, and well, as Steph has been saying, really quite a significant ignorance of the Methodist link to the story of the Tolpuddle Martyrs. It's interesting how we tend to read history from our own perspective and and using our own sort of particular lenses for it, and I think that works both ways. You know, that we perhaps do forget the degree to which Methodism was so closely involved in the development, the emergence of trade unionism. I mean, there were other Methodists who were involved in the formation of trade unions in other parts of the country. I think, was it Joseph Arch, I think, was another agricultural union that was formed, and he was a Methodist too. And I mean, I can remember one of the last general secretaries of the TUC, who was a Methodist. I'm just trying to think of his name now. He's a Methodist Sunday school teacher when I was a child, and I think those links with the unions have actually been lost on our side, as every bit as much as the unions have lost that link of the Tolpuddle Martyrs to Methodism, and unions to Methodism too. I mean, obviously Methodism is a broad church, and there are people from many other political persuasions and traditions within it, but that link with the unions is definitely there, and we've perhaps lost it a bit.
Thank you. I'm going to move on because we've got 3 questions that have come in. And so I'd like to take some time to think about those. I'll just ask each question, and then Steph or Simon, please jump in as you feel is appropriate. The first question we've got is from Ros Boxall, who is asking, was there any strike action used or planned? And I believe that relates to the Tolpuddle Martyrs' original campaign, I think, original actions.
Yeah. Not as far as I'm aware, not as far as anything that I've read would lead me to understand. They were about negotiating and persuading to better their lot, but I don't think they were planning to withdraw their labour. In fact, they probably worked harder, you know, for even less money, and pointed this out. Obviously, as farm labourers, you know, during the summer months where they were at their busiest, and during the winter months, they had to find other ways, you know, to try and survive. So, you know, if they'd withdrawn their labour in the summer, it would be themselves that they were starving by not bringing the harvest in. So I don't think that was contemplated. I don't know if Simon knows anything further on that, but that's what I believe.
No, I think that's absolutely right. Yes, somebody's just pointed out that it was Len Murray who was the.
Yes, I've seen that, yes.
I couldn't remember his name. Yeah.
Okay, we're getting more questions in now, so let's move on. John Yarian would like to ask, Does the story of the martyrs have anything to say to the Methodist Church today? I love the link between faith and our social activism.
John is the current Superintendent Minister, responsible for Tolpuddle, and has arrived recently and has yet to experience, as far as I'm aware, a full-on Tolpuddle Festival. So I think it does, and I think the work that we've been doing from the festival and with the Old Chapel and the publicity surrounding that, we're starting to sort of bring it back together and be able to tell the story again, because although yes it is a political story, yes it is a union story, I think that we are able to start retelling the story in a way that people understand. If you know, a few years ago when we were looking at the 200th anniversary of the Old Chapel, and we were talking about, you know, living wages and money going down and people not having enough food, it just so resonated with what was happening in the world at the time, pre-pandemic, that it just made absolute sense to tell the story, and in one way say nothing has changed, but in the other way say, but we still fight for justice. So I think that would be my take on that.
Certainly, the issues today of precarious work, people who on 0 hours contracts, who don't know from one day to the next or 1 week to the next whether their job is secure. I think we haven't won that battle yet by any means. And also modern day slavery, we hear more about now, and certainly the Methodist Church is involved in campaigning on both those issues, and perhaps we could draw more on our heritage and history to help us in those present campaigns to actually bring more dignity and security to working people and avoid this kind of precarious employment that we have had, again, as I said, pre-pandemic. I mean, maybe let us hope and pray that, through the experience of the pandemic, there may be a shift in attitudes towards this and that precarious work. But I think we can draw links.
Absolutely, thank you very much. Now I've got a couple of questions here that are a little bit longer, so bear with me. I've got Phil Martin here from the Tolpuddle Old Chapel Trust, and I know that we've had a question as well to explain a little bit more about the Old Chapel Trust. Phil is saying, we enjoyed these contributions, thank you. Interested in the point made about local Methodist support for the labourers from James Bridle, but isn't it also the case that the martyrs were virtually disowned by the conference, and that the presidents of the conference at the time, Bunting and Grindrod, disowned the martyrs through their silence? I think that's really quite a powerful thing. That's, that silence. Sometimes it's what we don't say as much as what we do say. And he says, and both the Primitives and the Wesleyans had prescribed the swearing of oaths, and the Wesleyans positively discouraged the membership of combinations, which is to say unions. So there's a lot in that question / comment, and I think what Phil, you actually, I'm just trying to work out what your question is. I think it's Phil is asking, isn't it always the case that there wasn't support from the Methodist Church and that the people in the hierarchy in Methodism kept to silence, I think is what the question is.
I think it's very probable that they did, but the local on the ground Methodists gave their support. I think it's often the case with anything new in Methodism, but in lots of other places, that people don't know how to react, so they keep silence and wait to see what happens. Unfortunately, that silence can do a lot of damage by not being supportive. And there were people who disagreed with what they did, but there were other people that supported them. I don't know what the stance on swearing oaths and things were, but they obviously were at their wits' end as to what to do. So forming the union was the thing they did, and they did swear an oath on the Bible, which to some would have been seen as absolute sacrilege, and others would have been seen as a binding commitment to what they were doing. So, as far as I personally know, but I haven't looked into this in a lot of detail, that yes, the conference very possibly sort of went, no, nothing to do with us, but the people, the people in the pews rallied round and helped, probably more from afar, but it's like anything. And as Simon says, we're a very broad church, and we probably were then, that some would say, yes, this is what we need to do, and others would be going, how dare they? But there was enough support that became. And there are still people today in Methodism who absolutely abhor the unions and Labour and anything to do with, left wing and socialism. But there are other people for whom it resonates. So I think it was Phil, yes, I think Phil's absolutely right, that there was silence from the top, but that doesn't mean there wasn't support lower down.
Sure, that's great. Thank you so much. We have got a question from Ross, who is part of the Glasgow Catholic worker community. Thank you so much for joining our WES Talk tonight, Ross. He says, hi, Steph, Simon. You mentioned that some of your work at the Tolpuddle Festival was about having conversations about the Christian faith of the martyrs. Did you encounter any negativity or opposition to Christianity from what we class as the modern, secular labour and trade union movement, or were most people quite positive, interested, and glad to learn more about the Methodism of the martyrs? And I believe also that Dudley has come in with an answer to that as well, saying, as someone who has often helped staff the Methodist stall at the festival, my answer to Ross is that we do encounter some negativity from secular trades unionists, but we also encounter trades unionists who are pleased to see us. And the question just disappeared off my screen. Oh, there it is. My experience is that the level of negativity is much lower at more recent festivals than it was when we first had a stall, even before Steph's time.
Yeah.
So I don't know if either of you would like to just, have you had any negativity at the festival? Maybe Simon to start?
No, although I think, not that I can remember, but I mean, Steph's sort of contact with the festival and festival goers is hugely greater than mine. Ours was just a few hours. So in that time, no, it was broadly just interest in what we were doing. It was a bit quirky to, walk from Bristol to the Tolpuddle Martyrs Festival. So I think people were just interested in that and sort of impressed by the commitment to walking all that way. So we didn't have any kind of, as it were, critique of the sort of religious background to what we were doing from a secular point of view. But maybe if we'd been there for longer and had more conversation, that may have, I wouldn't be surprised if that came out, because again, there's a pretty good cross section of views that must be there within those attending the festival. Okay, now we are running out of time, and so there's just a couple of questions that I do want to raise as we come to the end of our hour. Marie Ann asks, can anyone get involved in the Tolpuddle Festival? Is there a plan for another pilgrimage? Well, that's just, I suppose that's two different. I mean, if Steph answers about the actual festival itself, but yes, we are planning a pilgrimage. When I say we, Richard Sharp was a Methodist minister in Bristol at Victoria Methodist and two other Methodist churches in Bristol. We're planning a pilgrimage in 2022. So I think that's next year. I better double check with Richard before committing him to that.
Okay.
But I think we are definitely planning one, but quite whether it's next year or the year after, I'm not sure. But it's happening, and we will be using this guide that we're putting together now for that. And hopefully the guide will come out soon, so that people can do their own if they would like to. But we will be planning one in the next year or two.
That's good to know.
I was going to say, as for getting involved in the festival, I mean, you can come to the festival, you can book, you can pitch your tent, and you can be there. This year it's online, and I think you've just put up a thing from the new room that tells you the web address to get onto that. But John Yarian is the person now to ask, because he's the Superintendent Minister, and he will tell you what the involvement is. In previous years, we've had people staffing the new chapel. The TOCT people have been staffing the original chapel. We've been part of the Radical History School and doing the walk through the village and telling people about the story of the martyrs when we get to the chapels. We've been on the stall. We used to just be there one day, but now we're there longer, talking to people that want to come and engage with us, as well as the other stall holders. And we do the service on the Sunday afternoon at 5 o'clock, which is at the end, and we march in the parade, which obviously anybody and everybody is welcome to join in with. But John Yarian, current Superintendent Minister, will be part of the planning for what's happening in 2022, as I'm sure will Dudley Coates, the aforementioned Dudley Coates, because he's part of the group as well. So, you know, sort of watch this space and get in touch with the Dorset South and West Circuit, and they'll tell you what the Methodist involvement is. If you want to go as a private individual, then contact the Tolpuddle Martyrs Museum and book in.
If anybody's looking at the Q&A, you may notice a huge conversation going on between Ulrika and Dudley and Phil, who are all carrying on a very interesting conversation about how to get involved, about the Old Chapel Trust, about specific questions and about research. We probably don't have time to go into the rest of those questions, and I hope that, as Steph said, if people do want to carry on conversations after this talk, then they'll be able to get in touch with John and get in touch with the Tolpuddle Old Chapel Trust. If you want to talk to Simon about pilgrimage, I'm sure that that's possible too. But we have run out of time at the moment. On behalf of the New Room and the Learning Network, I'd like to offer a huge thank you to Steph and to Simon for speaking and reflecting on this topic this evening. We've really enjoyed listening to you both, and when we start these talks at 7:30, you never quite know which direction they're going to go, but I think we always seem to cover an awful lot of ground and touch on an awful lot of big issues in the space of an hour, and I think we've done that this evening as well, so thank you. Now that this, as I mentioned earlier, this talk is being recorded, and it will be placed as a digital download in the New Room's online shop, which can be accessed on the New Room's website, which is newroombristol.org.uk. If you've attended tonight, you'll be sent an email after the event with a 50% discount if you want to buy the talk and listen again. Or if you know anybody that hasn't been able to join us this evening, the talk will be available to buy and to download from the shop, and they can just go to the shop and do that themselves. One final notice to share is that the next talk in our WES Talk series will be on Monday, the 19th of July at 7:30 p.m. and actually follows on a little bit from this talk, because it's called A Passion for Pilgrimage. And again, the tickets are £5. And really what we want to do is carry on the idea of pilgrimage and explore it from a different angle. Because interest in following pilgrimage routes, old and new, has really spiked in the last few years, and thousands of people become pilgrims every year, not just the Tolpuddle. And so the next talk that we're having explores what does pilgrimage mean now? What is the difference between being a pilgrim and being a tourist? And we're going to be welcoming two different speakers next month, Steve Manscar and Melanie Gordon, who are co-leaders of the United Methodist Church's Wesley Pilgrimage, which intentionally brings pilgrims over from the USA to visit Wesley Methodist sites in Britain. And they're going to be reflecting on that aspect of pilgrimage. So do book your ticket online via the events section on the New Room's website. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at newroombristol.org.uk. Finally, as again, can I please just thank our speakers and thank you to everyone who has come along to the talk this evening, who's contributed a question. As you leave the talk, and I would ask our speakers just to stay for a few minutes. As you leave the talk this evening, we're going to bring up a poll question onto your screen regarding your thoughts on this evening. So please do answer the question before you click leave. So thank you so much for coming to this month's WES Talk, and we look forward to welcoming you to the next one.